Welcome to Net Positive, the podcast where we transform eco-anxiety into action through regeneration and resilience. Today's episode explores a critical question in sustainable design. Why do we still resist bio-based materials despite their proven benefits? For decades, industries have dismissed natural materials as weak, unreliable, or impractical compared to plastic, concrete, and steel. But this bias isn't just about performance, it's about deep-seated cultural perceptions that have shaped the way we think about materials. So, what if we flipped the narrative? What if we stopped seeing bio-based materials as alternative and started recognizing them as the future of the built environment? And how do we shift the mindset to unlock their full potential? Well, today we're joined by Anjanette Green, a leading voice in material transparency, sustainable building, and regenerative design. She's worked on some of the first certified green projects and has audited over 70,000 square meters of project space across 4 countries. She's co-developed one of the first global indoor air quality standards, and her work has taken her from corporate boardrooms to the Peruvian Amazon, where she's seen firsthand how small interventions create lasting impact. Anjanette recently completed the 2024 Green Materials Tour, traveling across 3 continents to explore innovative, high-performance, bio-based materials. And today, she'll share what she discovered and why we need to rethink everything we know about sustainable materials. I'm excited for today's episode, and key takeaways are why skepticism towards bio-based materials is more about bias than science, what the 2024 Green Materials Tour revealed about bio-based solutions outperforming expectations, and how shifting our mindset can unlock regenerative solutions for the built environment. Let's explore the future of materials with Anjanette Green. Hey, Anjanette, thanks so much for joining us on the episode.
That is such a nice introduction. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. We've had a lot of conversations, even preparing for this conversation and in the halls from various conferences where we've seen each other across the globe. But I'm really curious to understand more about your work and particularly about bio-based materials. And I'm hoping that you can help me unpack what are bio-based materials and tell me about some of the bias against them.
Yeah, that's a really fundamental and informed question to start with, because unfortunately, there isn't really a universally agreed upon term for a bio-based material, or what I'm using the term bio-based material. A lot of people will say a natural material, but I think that point is key to the rest of what we're going to be unpacking today, because there's just already not a lot of agreement. So when I talk about bio-based materials, when I use that term, I am casting a wide blanket across a lot of different natural materials that are readily available. This includes, earth-based soil, geological products, as well as plant-based products. Those are your rapidly renewable grasses and reeds. And then even living materials, like materials that are mycelium-based or growing materials. So it's a broad term, and I'm going to casually refer to all of that as bio-based materials.
Okay, it is like a mushroom cap rather than an umbrella.
Appropriate. Great use of analogy there.
Well, and I'm curious, is it because these types of materials aren't seen as preferable or as durable? What are some of, and who is the one deciding these, like making these kinds of decisions?
Yeah, well, it does run a little bit in 2 parallels that are definitely related. So a lot of this is indicative by code and regulation and testing and performance. Again, a really important topic that we're going to hopefully kind of dig into a little bit today. But even, different countries, the EU and the US, we have different definitions because we have performance criteria. So until we have a universal definition, it's almost impossible to put standards and testing criteria in place. And you can imagine if you had a different definition for steel and concrete, it would collapse the entire construction industry as we know it. And so this is where a lot of, the impediments come with bio-based materials. There is a lack of standardization. There is a lack of pushing forward to create these agreements. It's a bottleneck in any kinds of certifications that would then allow a building industry to use them and for builders to build with confidence without feeling like they're going to be under the lens of litigation and all those other things that come with building a building that's safe for the public.
Unpack a little for me where you see professionals dismiss bio-based materials.
Yeah. There are myriad reasons. And I think the go-to excuses really come from the fact that there is not a lot of education and experience with these materials. So what happens is you get a really big snowball effect. Not only will people not want to work with these materials, because why would you work with a material that is new and experimental to you? If you're in a professional trade, that puts you at risk. And most people in the building industry are very risk averse. So that also then means that for those that do decide they're going to work with those materials, they put a heavy price premium on them. So they kind of cover their butts, I guess, by pricing the materials in such a way as now they are perceived as being more expensive, where it's not the material itself per se that's more expensive. It's that they're packing on these added costs because they're going to be experimenting, and it could be added work, added timeline, all of those things. Now, on top of that, there are supply chain issues. This is unfortunately a re-emerging field of materials. A lot of these materials have been around prehistoric. We have evidence of that, show you a few of those examples, but we are reintroducing these materials. And so a re-emerging market means that supply chains are just nowhere near where industrialized materials are. So you have that added barrier. Now, the cultural piece is one thing that I really found incredibly enlightening throughout the years of my studying bio-based materials. My experience has been that there are two parts to this. Is bio-based materials, they have a perception of being weak or antiquated or out of style or representing a typology, a vernacular that we very much, unfortunately, as a society have decided is lowly or impoverished or beneath us. And that is something that I'm still trying to unpack, but it's a similar reaction that I've seen with a lot of designs and material palettes presented to affordable housing. When you have a scaled back and dialed back palette, it doesn't have all the bright and shiny plastic, petroleum-based white carpets and shiny plastic PVC wallpaper. Sometimes that means that people will have an adverse reaction. And unfortunately, bio-based materials have now this embedded bias that is from a social perspective.
And I can even imagine that color perception has a lot to play into that, with those hard surface materials are oftentimes gloss white.
Yeah.
And not only hard to maintain, but my fridge magnet won't stick to that fridge.
Yeah. And, we think of even like stories about, Cinderella, where she had to sweep a dirt floor. Just that alone, I don't think that we're even aware of how much of that influence has created this bias. I just don't think that most of us are even noticing it. There are some materials from my Green Materials tour where I saw this coming up again and again and again.
What an interesting, we should do another episode on like regenerative sustainability and fairy tales and how cultural bias permeates through storytelling and like tracked fairy tales across the globe.
I mean, the Three Little Pigs.
Brick house, straw house, they blew over.
The straw house, he blows it down. That's the first one to go. Where if you talk to the hempcrete people, listen, LA is going to do the right thing if they start putting hempcrete insulation, because that stuff is very flame adverse.
Mm-hmm.
It will ignite, yes, but it smolders. If you burn plastic or petroleum-based insulation, that stuff lights up like a tinderbox. Probably not the best analogy to use there.
Mm-hmm.
That lights up like a gasoline fire, because that's what it is.
Interesting. So part of our discussions too have been that bias isn't just technical, but is in that social and cultural perception. And I happen to know that you've lived in many different places across the globe. Do you find that this cultural perception is different or different magnitudes in different places across the globe?
That's such
Or is
an
there a
interesting
common
question.
thread there?
Definitely a common thread. Yeah. Very much a common thread. I haven't been everywhere, let's just be clear. But for the different regions that I have explored, it is very much a similar association. Earth materials, earthen materials, in some cases, even earth-colored materials. A project in Colombia, one of the reasons why the project team was able to proceed with the design using compressed brick, just compressed earth brick. These are not your traditional oven-baked brick. These are just earth compressed, made into blocks, is because they come in non-traditional red or earthen colors. They come in white. They come in bisque, So if design and color theory, if that can reach an audience to bring more of these materials into the fore, great. But what it does is it just continues to enunciate the fact that this earthen sort of structure has fell out of fashion.
What's something that has really blown your mind in terms of a bio-based material?
Yeah, well, I mean, these are largely lessons that I took away from the Green Materials Tour. So, the first thing is cactus leather. I had no idea that you could make leather out of cactus. Is
You
this a good
shared some
segue
images,
into this?
right?
Okay.
This is a good segue. You shared some images. If you don't mind, I'm going to bring them up on the screen and tell us more about these types of materials, please.
Yeah, I had so much fun, and I do want to take a moment to thank all of the manufacturers who welcomed me into their studios, their labs. I went into chemistry labs, after a cold call and an email. So I just huge, huge thank you. This is Deserto. This is a leather that's made out of cactus. They use two different types of cactus. They use an agave and a derivative of cactus that grows prolifically in the area. It does not need any fertilization, does not need water. I mean, it just grows. It's hard to kill. So one of the real benefits about this is that this leather, I was under the perception that it was going to be a little bit delicate. They make boxing gloves and running shoes out of this leather. It is incredibly strong, and it doesn't have any additives in it, colorants and things like that. Sure. And, for me to see that Adidas is making boxing gloves and Nike is making shoes out of this material was a huge eye-opener, because not only were those major brands using this material, but this is material that's just, a cactus growing out in, the deserts of Guadalajara. And so visiting this mill was fantastic.
Well, that's interesting. We'll share your next image.
I have such a soft spot in my heart for this fourth generation family in Jaén, which is a region in southern Spain where Asparto, which is a grass reed, it grows like prolifically. Like they'd pull it out and throw it away, basically, or they did in years past. It also grows up in the northern part of Africa. But, thousands of years ago, when the farmers would pull this grass out, which was just what they considered invasive, they would throw it in the river. But when they did that, they found that when you soak Asparto, it gets really pliable and malleable. So one of the things that's really surprising and surprised me about Asparto, and you can see in this photo, the darker Asparto at the bottom and that lighter is a difference of 100 years.
Oh, what? That's
So
100 years old?
that's a 100-year-old Asparto. And that item that he's holding, this is a grain carrier or like a food carrier that you would put over a burro or a horse or whatever. So they would use this in the agricultural industry. So that dark colored Asparto is over 100 years old. It was used every single day to go along in the fields collecting grain. So this is where my mind kind of was blown, because I don't know of any other material that can get that degree of UV exposure.
I was going to wonder how it performs in the sun.
Plastic and rubber. If anybody has ever traveled and you had like a plastic hair tie, or maybe the elastic in your swimming trunks, or anybody who wears a bikini, that elastic, you have it for like one summer, because UV breaks down any kind of plastic like rubber and synthetic so quickly. So it remains pliable in the sun. And in fact, the sun makes it stronger. It's when it's exposed to shade and to water, it becomes pliable. Now, obviously, this is just like, well, what other applications can we use this for? I mean, obviously, you can use this for making shoes. They make soles of shoes out of Asparto. But I really want to implore the architecture and design industry, think about when you need a material that has these properties, and then start digging into this new bio-based library of materials.
And I would imagine the flexibility, you've mentioned that like grain carriers on, so I would imagine there's a lot of repetition and flexing that happens, that this fiber would need to be quite strong to hold up over time, and I would imagine generations.
Yeah. The owner of this, he's 77 years old. He retired, and then he gave the item back to the original maker. But, the 30 years prior to it, it was used by another individual. So, I mean, it's passed down. And so not only flexibility, but generational use. And when you think about how this was engineered, it's almost like origami, the way that they stitch it together so that it can actually move. Now, if you want it to be stiff and rigid, you don't soak the reeds. You don't soak the Asparto. So if you want something really stiff, and you want something like, they create stools and chairs and bed frames and other furniture out of Asparto. But if you want it to be pliable and you want to make a hammock or something that has contact with your skin, you can actually soak it in water and you get that pliability.
That's interesting. Okay,
I know. See,
so cool.
biomaterials are so fun.
Right?
They really are.
This is an amazing structure. Tell us about bamboo structures.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are far more experts in the world when it comes to bamboo, but I was really fortunate to work on site with my friend Miguel from Mystical Architecture. For a small bit, I was able to watch them put this structure up. Now, the thing that's really cool about this is the palapa that they're putting up, a shade structure that's over a bar in one of the big hotels out in Cancun. And you can see the palm trees in the background there. You can see how much wind.
They're all blowing over to the sun. Mm-hmm.
And that's just normal. That is average, normal, now. This structure is going to be partnered with smaller palapas that are, like little individual bungalows. And they had originally thought that they were going to the hotel, were going to build those individual structures using concrete columns. Mm-hmm. But because of this region's high wind and obvious, tropical storms, you are not permitted to build concrete columns for that use because it's a liability. They cannot withstand it. And when they fall in a disastrous way. Bamboo is flexible. if anybody has watched a building be built in China, they use bamboo scaffolding for this very reason. It
I've
can
seen that,
bend
yeah.
and it can move where, it's strong, but its flexibility allows it to speak with the nature and move with nature as it needs to without collapse. So again, this material, if anybody has worked with laminated timber, the latas in the middle, that is a series of bamboo slats that have been combined together and then bound. So it's kind of a similar, process of using glue lam. You laminate the pieces together, you create a structure. And the beauty of it is that you can make these incredible lengths, you can make various widths, and it's still really flexible.
Well, what I can see here and infer is that these different layers, but with a mechanical fastener, but not a chemical adhesive,
Nope.
they're not rigidly stuck together, that there's some slippage there if a big burst of wind happens. Not only is this structure already shaped to deflect a lot of that wind, but also that it could flex with that. That makes a lot of sense.
Yep. No adhesives, zero adhesives on any part of the construction. There is waterproofing that can be applied, and in this case, there's a waterproofing layer, but there's no adhesives. This is just steel, nails, and mechanical fasteners.
Tell us about this material.
This is so fun. And, again, this is one of those examples of photographs don't do justice to the innovativeness of this material. But when you learn of what it is, you have such a new level of respect. And this goes to the heart of what I was talking about before, where there's just really a lack of understanding and appreciation of these materials. And what we need to do is, sort of check our knee-jerk reactions at the door. But this is Blak. And I was so lucky I had one day that I was able to visit Blak because they were moving their facilities for a larger production area. This is the residual waste that comes from the mezcal industry.
Okay.
And the mezcal industry in Mexico is huge, massive. And it creates a gargantuan amount of both fiber waste and liquid waste. And so one bottle of mezcal creates multiple bottles and piles of bagazo and liquid waste. It is an imbalanced equation. So the innovator here is using the fiber waste and the liquid waste, 100%, no potable water goes into this, and mixing it with just a little bit of local earth, usually coming directly from an excavation site, to make these blocks, which come in various sizes, but are meant to just basically be used with the existing infrastructure. So these blocks are made in the same machines that you make standard concrete blocks. And what's so amazing about these are heavy. You can see me trying to pick one up.
I can't see it.
I mean, I'm not like a super hero or anything, but these are manageable. You can lift them up. So while it looks like it's really hefty, these are lighter than a concrete block, which means that they're easier on the impact for carbon for transportation, but also they're manageable because you can make different sizes. So somebody like me, I could actually build a house with these because I personally could not only pick them up, but I could design with them. And so what's cool performance-wise with these is that not only is this diverting a ton of waste, but the ideal here is that it's also going to be giving jobs back to a very inequitable and unequal industry in the areas. The production of mezcal is unfortunately putting a lot of pressure on local communities and trying to give back a job to them, not only to take care of the waste, but give them, an economy. Again, that social aspect of bio-based materials is huge. That potential is huge. So, the LCA studies on this that were done are showing that these can avoid 0.425 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. And so that means that for every 48 square meters that you build an aga block, you can avoid 2 tons of CO2. So that's equivalent. Basically, all you need to know about this is that when you build an average size kind of structure, let's say a residence, you are going every 48 square meters is going to be equal to planting and maintaining 30 trees for over 10 years.
Well, I'm curious too, to take this even into a bit of a different direction, is what about just the knowledge of how to produce these materials? Do you see that knowledge continuing on, or is it being lost to time?
Yeah, and that's one of my biggest questions, I guess. Oh, that's such a poignant question, because the first part of that I often am trying to address and that I struggle with is we have put so much time and energy and the world's talent into propelling and education and understanding and reformulating petroleum-based and very heavily industrial, chemically based products. Imagine what the world would have looked like or could look like if we had put that much energy, time, wisdom, the best scientists in the world, instead of studying the plastics and creating the myriad plastics that we have. What would have happened if they had studied mycelium? I think that, gut response to that would be we would not see such a massive difference in where we are. There's this repetitive nature of the petroleum-based products always excelling because that's where the money is going and that's where the research is going. It's a huge disadvantage. And when you, on top of that, have very niche or specific or small grassroots teams trying to do the work that a massive industry can do, I mean, you just will never compete with that. We have conveniently dismissed the masters and the people who know how to make these materials. So your initial question was, how do you make these? How do you manufacture them? A lot of these materials, a lot of these interviews that I do, it's kind of heartbreaking because I ask them and like, yeah, well, my grandfather knew how to make it, or my grandmother knew that recipe, but like, we don't know. We don't know what it is. And I was on a job site where they were making rammed earth. And rammed earth is a very specific science-based and chemistry. They're not out there with a chemistry kit or a lab kit. They're out there and they're actually smelling the soil. They're touching the soil. A lot of them taste the soil to know if the chemistry is right. What happens when there's nobody around who can do that? Now, let me be clear. I am not trying to say that the future of building is to have somebody out tasting the material and that's a sign of its structural performance. Of course not. I'm trying to understand, how do you scale that type of wisdom and knowledge? You can do it in a lot of ways, but nobody is studying that. And we are very quick to dismiss it. As an industry, we are very quick to quiet that type of innate regional wisdom. And it's important, really important, that we address that.
Well, my mind is starting to explore that lived experience and hands-on application versus technical guidance documentation for not only that replicability, but just and standardization, because you can't necessarily say to your materials engineer, what does it taste like?
Yeah.
Is there enough oomph in there to make it work properly? And then there's a whole nother little thought that I had here when you mentioned grandma and grandpa's recipes is, if you've ever tried to remake something from grandma's recipe, she did not write down her secret ingredients. And so even though there's some natural materials in there, there's still technique and process and how do you do it? How long do you let it dry for? And et cetera, et cetera.
All of that.
There's some magic in there to make this work. So I'd be curious, even in a whole nother episode, to unpack with you just the magic behind all of these materials. My great uncle had a rude saying of PFM, of it's just pure magic how this works
Yeah,
sometimes. And so I think that there is artistry in there as well. It takes a long time to make this happen this way.
100% agree.
You've got one more image here. Tell us a little more about paint.
Yeah, well, this is actually very appropriate to follow that conversation because these are handprints. I think that you probably read my description. I don't think would you ever imagine the age that this paint is?
I mean, just the type of image and the color of the pigment makes me think that it's much earlier in our existence.
Yeah, it's prehistoric. So these are caves that are in the region outside of Oaxaca, meatless caves. There's a series of caves, like actually over 200. It's part of a UNESCO protected site now, thankfully. But these are prehistoric, and testing. There's 3 different dated layers that date back over 10,000 years. Now, I don't know the last time you actually looked at a paint warranty, but I don't think there's any paint out there that will put a 10,000-year warranty on their paint. So again, this is where I start. I try not to be frustrated, but this is where I start to have these internal conversations with myself saying, if we have examples of natural and bio-based materials, including paint, that precede, any type of architecture that we have ever built, then why can't it be a possibility that these materials are durable enough to build with now?
Mm-hmm.
So, the cool thing about this cave, there's 3 different layers of paint, as I mentioned. There's red, there's white, and there's black. You can
Okay.
see some of the black
Yeah,
in
yeah.
this, and you
Can
can,
see some
and because of the layers of the overlapping is what helped them to date. And there are
Mm-hmm.
thousands of years in between. So not only did they have a recipe, and by the way, we don't know what scientists, they don't know what this recipe was. They don't know what it was. And when I talked to one of my indigenous guide who took me through the caves, and she was explaining to me, oh yeah, my grandmother had paint recipes that she used, and she made blue, and you're like, these are things that are lost to time.
Mm.
And I can't help but get frustrated with not only people's response to, oh, there's no alternative that's going to last and it's going to perform as best as what we've been using, that's plastic and petroleum and chemical based. Because there's a lack of education and there's a lack of curiosity and exploration. And what happens, unfortunately, is when that is the messaging that we continually get, we acquiesce. We resign to that, well, that's what it is, and we accept that. And I can't accept it when I keep seeing these amazing examples over and over again that are not only compelling, but this color has been exposed to UV on the side of a cave for 10,000 years. Tell me this doesn't have
Dust
performance
particles
strength.
abrading it away.
Yeah. The hardest conditions. And here it is looking bright red.
Well, and I think too, I'm going to stop sharing so I can see a little better, but it kind of goes to one of the points that we talked about in our discussion, that our work does leave an impact, and often in ways we don't see until years later, and maybe not even in our lifetimes.
I
I'm
think that's a
curious.
really important reminder, Richard. That's so key, especially today when I think a lot of us who have been in this industry for a while, you can reach a point of suffering from burnout. And we don't often get a lot of props for what we do. And I think that all of us do have to kind of come to terms with the fact it's like you may remain an unsung hero. And that is one of our realities. It's a shame. But when you do get recognition, it propels you. And that's why I think, this podcast and what you're doing and paying it forward and giving platforms, all of us should follow this example.
Thank you, Anjanette. So you've gotten to go to the four corners of the globe in your travels, and you've seen definitely a lot of different types of projects. But what project comes to mind that has provided you a lot of lessons along your path?
I mean, there's so many to draw from, but the game changer experience for me was when I went to the Peruvian Amazon, because the Green Materials Tour has been life-changing as well, but I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have had the courage to do that if I had not previously gone to the Amazon to volunteer for the project to build a base camp for scientists who are doing research to preserve a parcel of land, a concession of land deep in the Peruvian Amazon, where, we were warned to go in and leave no trace as much as possible. When I got to the camp, my job was to help them build things that were not going to leave a print or that could be, packed out. So much impact had already been done that really my job became a waste assessment exercise.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that was a surprise, and that was a learning lesson of itself. I was expecting to go in and I unlocked the mysteries of the jungle. No, it was basically, we need to clean our mess up. How do we do that? Because, that's really the urgency of where they needed my skills. So that's where I went to work.
What were some of the experiences that you had on site there?
Yeah. So as part of that whole assessment, it really asked me to look at everything. Okay. Every single piece of waste that we produced, we had to figure out how to use it and use it well. It had to be turned into a net positive. So I created a composting toilet, the first that they had ever had. And that was very difficult because I've never built a composting toilet before. And like we're talking about today, the perception of a composting toilet for a lot of people who have never used one is, oh, they're going to smell, it's messy, it's gross. So my job as the designer was, okay, not only do I have to understand how to technically build a composting toilet, I got to build the prettiest, most beautiful one in the world to convince them that this is worth doing. And I built that thing with my own two hands. I had the help of my co-building partner down there, and she and I'd like to think we built an incredibly beautiful composting toilet. The other was composting food waste and understanding all the food waste from the kitchen, everything from eggshells to the amazing amounts of citrus peels. So
Citrus pills.
Yeah, so we got rid of all of our chemical-based detergents and soaps and made all of our cleaning products out of citrus peels. So I had to learn how to do that because there's a very specific way to make soap and detergents out of citrus waste. The other was the cooking oil. Now, this became my big aha moment because up until now, food compost, it's making soil. I mean, there are many people who do this across the world, making composting toilets. But for me, when I was looking at the cooking oil, we didn't have a lot, but we had enough that it was problematic. And I thought, well, I do know that I know how to make soap. And I do know that you can use various oils for making soap. Now, this is pretty crude because it's post-cooking, but what can I do? Well, it turns out that up the river, there is a family in a small parcel called Lucerna that were cacao farmers. And for anybody who knows anything about the chocolate industry, it is incredibly competitive and farmers never get a fair wage for the amount of work that goes into making chocolate. There's a reason why fair trade chocolate is something that most of us have heard about. It is a real concern. So I thought, well, why don't we partner? Because cacao is a really great fat. I wonder if they would give me some of their cacao, some of the fat, and I could combine it with my crappy oil and we could make something cool. Let's make chocolate soap. So I just, as a fluke, went to the family and I inquired and I did my own little experimental soap in a Pringles can. And they were so curious about it that when it came time to do the reveal, like the entire community came out and they were like, what you've made? Because to them, this was a game changer. They were able to now go to their chocolate trade fairs, which is, again, fiercely competitive, and have an extra commodity that they could show. Not only because, it's not that it was going to be a business to business sales, but to show that they were really innovative, that they were creating new things with chocolate. It's not just about the cacao seeds and chocolate bars. It's like you can make these other products. So I come to find that the matriarch of the family became so interested, we organized a soap making class. I came to the community, did the soap making class. And if you know anything about soap, it has to cure. So we came, we made it, and I left. And I never really knew what happened after that. I never really knew what happened after the composting toilets. I never really knew what happened after we designed the food composting system. I never knew what happened to that last batch of soap until almost 5-6 years later, when I was just actually asking that same friend of mine who was my partner working on the site, come to find that they liked the composting toilet so much that they replicated that and built 4 more.
Even better.
One on every platform. The compost from the soil actually ended up becoming soil to plant 100 that were planted by volunteers in the Amazon, which had been completely deforested. And the soap, that family ended up going online, making their own online soap with their own beautiful graphics, and made the soap available for sale. So I would have never have guessed that any of that would have happened just because I went down to try to find magical materials in the Amazon. And it really is, I think, a call to action, a reminder to all of us who are doing what we do. You have to keep up the good fight. You have to.
Anjanette, this has been an amazing conversation so far, and we're not even close to being done yet. So this is a great extended episode version, a juicy conversation. But I'm really curious, your pathways, I've alluded to, have taken you around the globe. But how did you even get to where you are today? Was it a straight line? Have you been on an adventure? Tell me more.
I've been on many adventures. It's a bit of a love-hate kind of story that I have. I think a lot of the paths that I have taken have not often been my first choice. They were a result of conditions that were challenging.
Okay.
I ended up having to move to China, not because it was my first choice to uproot my life and leave my family and go thousands of miles away to a place where I didn't speak the language and didn't know anybody. I went there because after the 2008 market crash, there just wasn't a whole lot of opportunities for somebody with my skill set. And, China, the Asia market was booming. And I thought, well, maybe I can be useful there. And that did end up being a great move because I met really innovative people. And that is where I ended up writing the indoor air quality standard, which I'm not an air quality expert. I am now, but I wasn't at the time. That was sort of pushed on me. So again, here we are in a situation where a lot of people are, losing their jobs or having a lot of anxiety about what their future holds. I think this is, again, those paths and those challenges when they're put in front of you, sometimes that is the right path and it just bumps you into this direction that you're meant to go.
Well, it sounds like a nice pivot point there. And my guess is that you've had some other pivot points along the way on your adventure.
it's been a huge adventure.
And a tasty adventure. You've had quite a few opportunities to chocolate you've mentioned here. You've mentioned even over some meals that we've had together, just fun experiences of global cuisine. But I'm really curious too how your pathway has shaped your commitment, and what has really driven you forward in this?
I mean, I think for me, it's these individual experiences and stories, and I just have this, gut feeling that there are there's great materials and construction to come. I love materials so much. I can't explain to you my fascination with them. I've always been fascinated with materials. My dad's a structural engineer. I remember being on job sites and collecting like wire and stuff and making jewelry out of it and asking how this works and how's that put together, and building everything, as a kid, Legos. I love how things come together, and I love the chemistry of materials. And I think when it comes to natural materials, that chemistry is even more fascinating and largely misunderstood as far as how do we put that into our current situation. How do we become these amazing matchmakers? How do we take the criteria that we're looking for? I need something that's flexible. I need it to be wind resistant. And then where's the bio answer to that?
Amazing matchmaker. I think that's a perfect title for you.
I tend to, yeah. I'm really excited actually. For the first time, I've always been really interested in these new sort of swells of seaweed that are happening because the oceans are getting warmer. Every year it's become a big problem in coastal territories like around Florida. So sargazo, there's, even a satellite map that shows you when it's coming, because tourist beaches don't like it. And it is a problem because in those vast quantities, if it comes to shore, it will degrade, and it does all kinds of things like emit methane and all kinds of issues and problems related to having huge clumps of an organic material on the coastline. But there's a lot of people who are trying to figure out, well, how do we use this and how can we turn it into different products? Because before they're just carting it away and burning it, which is a big no-no. So for the first time, I just fell into this group, which is cross-international, cross-interdisciplinary, that are looking at ways to use seaweed. So myself, who is kind of address independent, 2 individuals on both sides of Canada, another individual in Germany, and then my seaweed experts that are in Mexico. So, who knows? This could actually turn into something that is cross-continental answer to what a lot of people perceive as a nuisance. Could be really interesting. We'll see.
That's so cool, Anjanette. Well, I want to introduce you to the next segment. It's the community garden, and it's a conversation framework around rose, thorn, and bud. Have you ever done that before? Used that framework before?
No, but it's intriguing.
All right. Well,
Let's see how I do.
All right. It is not a test. Let me give you a little overview here. A rose is something positive or inspiring in your world these days. You're one of my roses. You're very positive and inspiring. Happening in your world right now that's blooming for you. A thorn is a prickly problem that is, drawing blood to the fingertips, or an obstacle that we could help you to solve. And a bud is hopeful for the future. Hope for the future. Given enough sunlight and warmth, will turn into something amazing. So, Anjanette, tell me something that's really fragrant and blossoming in your world these days.
This is such a interesting. I'm going to probably repeat a few things, so forgive that. But for me, as I mentioned, when some of the slides were going up and I was giving so much thanks to the manufacturers and the people who let me in, the rose is the amount of just openness, which I was actually so surprised when I would just email a manufacturer, I like what you do. I like what I see. Can I come in? calling some of them.
Mm.
They don't know who I am. And they're like, sure, come on. 90%, probably more like 95% of the manufacturers and companies that I contacted replied to me and welcomed me in and allowed
Wow.
me to film them, allowed me to film their interiors, their process, everything. And I think, again, for those of us who've been in the industry, we're so jaded because we're accustomed to, especially manufacturers, being incredibly guarded. They don't want to tell us anything. They don't tell us their formulas. Everything is proprietary and all of that, which I can appreciate. But you can imagine what a contrast that was for me. I was like, wow, I
Right.
can come in. I went into paint formula labs where
Wow.
they have machinery and all their formulas, and they were allowing me to
Exhaust.
film everything. And I asked, are you sure I can film? Like, yeah, sure. So that was such a refreshing rose of a moment.
Well, and I can imagine too, it breaks down a lot of the barriers because now you can bring interest and intrigue to the conversation and ask and feel comfortable asking questions about how this works or what some of the challenges they've had along the way are solved for. And
And,
maybe this is, oh, go ahead.
more importantly, it made me realize how jaded I had become.
There you go. Yeah, that makes
Yeah,
sense.
I think that was the real moment for me, tiptoeing around and, walking on egg. Can I please? Like, sure, come on in. Yeah, that was pretty cool.
So tell me what a challenge you're having.
I mean, for me, a lack of bandwidth, first of all. I mean, I wish that I had a team. So
Literal,
that's a big,
figurative.
yeah. I wish that I had a team of people to help me out with the mountain of video that I have. This stuff really needs to see the light of day. There's so many more innovators than what I've been able to even scratch the surface of. But I just have to manage myself with the time and energy that I can. But hand in hand with that are the ones that got away. And what I mean by that is there are so many manufacturers that really deserved to be part of a larger platform. And
Highlighted.
for whatever reason, most of it financial, those barriers prevented them. And it's just heartbreaking when you can see the potential and it slips away. And you can imagine what it's like to live in a world where you see materials and products that are full of chemicals. And in my opinion, that makes them inferior. And that there is an equivalent out there that is not, that it just couldn't make it to market.
Maybe I can reframe the ones that got away to those whose songs go unsung, who just have amazing solutions or products or abilities, but just for some reason or another, don't get that recognition that they need. Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that. And now looking into the future and hope, what do you see emerging on the horizon?
Yeah, I mentioned before, I think I'm old enough now and have been doing this long enough now. And because I have very much been privileged to be able to go and travel, I am not like most people. I can pack up. My passport allows me to go to all these places. Very few people around the world have that kind of flexibility. So I am incredibly grateful for that, as it is currently. And with that, it has allowed me to make a lot of connections. So being that grand liaison, but also being responsible for making those connections, listening and being very aware so that when in a conference in Mexico City, I hear somebody talking about something that relates to my team that's working on a product in Guatemala, my job is to put those things together. So my amazing cross-disciplinary project I was talking about with Canada, Mexico, United States, Germany, that actually might be built someplace in Spain. I mean, this is the kind of thing that gives me hope for the future, because this goes right back to our introduction conversation. when we can get more people from a global perspective to actually share and impart their wisdom, we will finally get to a common definition. We will finally then be able to propel that definition into testing that allows for standardization, that allows for regional code performance. Municipalities can start to build this into their construction codes, and we will finally be able to scale. But if I have anything at all to do with being a Kickstarter to that, that's where I feel like I have a bud in the future.
Well, and you actually teed up my next question perfectly, which, continuing this gardening theme, is what sort of actionable tips, tricks, or techniques as seeds, wildflower seeds, could you give away? But I'm going to answer that question for you just in my observation. And where I really feel like you plant seeds of hope is not only through advocacy, but through boldness. I've never known you to shy away from a good conversation or raising your hand to find out more information or make that connection. Even in your description here, you hear across the room someone talking about a topic or subject that you know some information in. So I would imagine that boldness may be one of your actionable tips, but tell us a little more. What kind of wildflowers do you have?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, be aware. Constantly be somebody who is listening for connections. If you have the ability to be proactive with those connections, please foster them. And sometimes it's just a matter of acknowledging somebody for that idea. That can often be a lot. But I would also, on the flip side of that, is squash the negativity.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was in a group I belonged to a group, and one of the things, our group morale is really down. And you have to wonder, is it down because you're saying it, or is it really down? It's this very, nebulous thing when you talk that way. So when you hear people sort of smack about bio-based materials and natural construction, and they give it that sort of negative slant, you really have to say, well, is it? Just ask an informed question. Why do you perceive it that way? If there's a study or there's something we can dig into, great. But again, if that's just a knee-jerk reaction, the next time you hear somebody with those sort of like negative sentiments that focus on all the shortcomings and all the failures, I really hope that you're compelled to say something that's a more informed response, because I just think that we're too quick to dismiss that. And then again, all of that negativity sucks the air out of.
That's such a great tip. That's just a life tip. Thanks so much for sharing that one there. Okay, last question around our community garden is around gardeners, and who have been your mentors along the way that have helped you to grow? And the other side of that conversation, who are you helping to grow? Little seedling.
I mean, Rachel Carlson is just like huge hero of mine. And Silent Spring, not only was she an innovator in her field, she was a woman who decided to speak out in a time where it was hard to do that. But, at the time, I can't imagine the courage that it took for her. So not only is that writing and her research just incredibly informed and very science-based, and we still refer to that, but her personality to have the grit to do that, because I think that mycelium is fantastic, and it has obviously come into fore as a powerhouse innovative material. People keep hearing about, insulation made out of fungi and things like that. But I think we really have Paul Stamets to thank for a lot of that. And the reason why I really am drawn to Paul is because of his life hardships that are also parallel to his work and his drive to move forward. So for all of us who have had hardships in our personal life, but still carry on and do the hard work in our professional life, that is a really difficult balance to strike. And I think Paul, he's amazing. And then all of my innovators that I wish that I had more time, but for those, who want to look at them, they can go look at my Instagram and don't spend too much time there, but go and please look at some of the innovators and go to their links. I will hopefully have more, but all of my green materials tour manufacturers, they're my heroes. What they do, Richard, you're up there too. You're one of them.
Can you see my blush on camera? Wow, this is amazing. And these innovators that you've mentioned for the green materials innovators, I have cruised through your Instagram feed and we'll certainly post it down in the chat. But wow, so many stories to tell. So
too many.
This is amazing. Well, hey, I want to ground our conversation in our last segment and ask you about nature, returning to nature and where you go to recharge. Tell me about one of your favorite places in nature.
There's, again, I've been privileged to be around the world in a lot of places, but there are two. And, you were kind enough to give me this question in advance because I don't know if that I would be able to off the cuff give you a response. I thought about this and there's two that I really love. The first one is a running trail in the old olive groves that are above the Generalife, which is above the Alhambra in Granada, Spain, which is where I live part-time. The history, like being in the olive groves that are like 100 years old or even more, and seeing the view and seeing the sky, and there's a certain smell of the soil there that's very unique, especially in the summer. There's a certain smell that when I'm there, there's just such a sense of peace that I have. And the other kind of similar to that is my other favorite running trail, which is through the jungle that's just outside of Playa de las Cuevas in Mexico. And I love that because, again, because of the heat and humidity and the jungle, it feels like it's just kind of crushing on you. And when you come out of your running trail, you see this huge beach. So there's some similarities there, but I think that any place in nature, but for me, those are the two that stand out.
Anjanette, this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm really grateful that you've joined me here today. We've talked about bio-based materials. You've helped us to understand about any bias that we may bring into the conversation and just opening our minds and our ears and listen for the song of these amazing materials to include in our work. You've talked about the promotion of bio-based materials and those manufacturers, those innovators who really deserve to have that conversation. And thank you for sharing us about bias and the subtle and pervasive conversations that happen, and that it really is up to advocacy and education and bringing those teams together in conversation on testing and performance. I think that goes a long way through storytelling as well, as that's proof in the pudding there when you can show hard data around the high performance of these materials. And I think that helps to really squash some of that negativity, as you've mentioned. And just a lot of gratitude for your creativity and sharing that you are an innovator yourself. So thank you for giving your time and talent to these materials. It's a lot of inspiration in this conversation, and I am certainly leaving inspired for the research and the work that you've been doing. So Anjanette, I hope that you'll come back for another conversation soon. And thank you so much for joining me here on Net Podsitive.
It was my pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for helping to give a voice to something that I really love. Thank you.
All right. Well, everyone, remember, big changes start small, and we can see that here in our Pathfinder today. Anjanette, thanks again.
Thank you.